Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video about setting up a VPN server. In this video, we'll start off by talking about exactly what a VPN is and how you can use it within your organization. We'll then take a look at the supported authentication protocols within a Windows Server 2008 VPN server. Then we'll take a look at how to choose which VPN protocol you want to use to encrypt the data in the communication. And I will tell you there's a new one to Windows Server 2008 that we've never seen before. Take a quick look at the Global Mantic scenario, see what's going on, see how we can resolve their dilemma. And then we're going to go into the operating system and see how to actually install and configure the remote access service to provide VPN connectivity. So, what is a VPN? Well, VPN, the letters VPN, stand for Virtual Private Network. Now, basically what this means is that a VPN allows users to securely connect to their local network from a remote computer. Okay, so when you have users who are away from the office, maybe you have traveling users who have laptops and they're in a hotel room, they need access to local resources within your network. They can do so using VPNs. What happens is that the remote computer, that laptop, let's say, that they have with them in the hotel room, virtually becomes part of the local network. That's what's kind of cool about it, is even though they're in some other location, pretty much, could be anywhere else in the world, they are able to not only connect to the network, but their computer, once the connection has been established, becomes part of the local network, meaning it's almost as though that computer is physically sitting within the boundaries of our own local network. And this is why VPNs have been used for many, many years and are so popular with network administrators, because it provides such a secure way to allow people to be away, but not really. All right, so what authentication protocols do we have available to us in Windows Server 2008? Well, the first option is right here, unauthenticated. And look at this, bad idea. Yes, you essentially never want to do this. You do have the ability to let pretty much anybody VPN into your network, and I don't think I need to explain why this is such a bad idea. You need to have some level of control over who's connecting to your network. Now, we still have the old PAP, Password Authentication Protocol, which gives us very, very low security. Basically, PAP was the concept of, can we assign a username and password? I mean, that's, plain and simple. Can we assign one, and can it be transmitted through this VPN? Can it be transmitted remotely? It's all done in plain text. There's no security whatsoever on this particular username or password, which means that somebody using PAP could have their credentials stolen from them very easily. So if we wanted to move up one level, we could go to CHAP, which is the Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, which I have listed as medium security. At least in this case, there's some level of negotiation that takes place between the client and the server, and the credentials are not passed in pure plain text. So you have a little bit more security there, but because CHAP is an open standard to where any operating system can use it, we're somewhat limited on those rules because they need to support everybody. And as a matter of fact, pretty much the only place you would ever use CHAP would be if you had non-Microsoft clients. So if you have clients that are out there and they're not running Microsoft operating systems, that's where you would use CHAP. And by the way, to answer the question of where you'd use PAP, I'd probably put that pretty much in the category with the unauthenticated. Just never. I can't think of any scenario where you'd really want to use PAP. Now, if we want to get into an actual decent level of security, we want to move into MS CHAP, which simply stands for Microsoft Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, or Microsoft CHAP. And you'll notice here that it says MS CHAP v2, version 2. There was an MS CHAP v1 and an MS CHAP v2, and pretty much the only difference is time. Older operating systems, or older Microsoft operating systems, had MS CHAP v1, and the newer ones have MS CHAP v2. These days, because you'd have to go pretty far back to find a client that does not support MS CHAP v2, that's the only one that's really been included in Windows Server 2008. And this will provide a high level of security on the authentication, really it's the securing of the authentication credentials is what we're talking about here. Now, if we want to go to the highest level of security altogether, well, then we're going to go ahead and use EAP-TLS, the Extensible Authentication Protocol with Transport Level Security. Now, the reason this is the highest form of security is because here we're not using traditional usernames and passwords. This is where we're going to now move into multi-factor authentication along with our remote access solution. And what I mean by multi-factor is, see, there's three factors, if you want to call it that, when it comes to authentication. And the three factors are what you know, and that's the typical username and password. Well, I know my password. What you have is a second factor that's available, and what you have would be you have to physically have something in your possession. Very commonly would be a smart card or a token. So you'd physically have to have something. And the third factor is who you are. Okay, and that's where we get into biometrics, where maybe we do a fingerprint scan or a retina scan. Now, when we talk about EAP-TLS, we can support any of this, but primarily we're going to be talking about using a smart card or a token. And the reason we call it multi-factor, even though that was just one of the factors, what you have, is along with that smart card or token, you have to also know the PIN or password. So it's what you have and what you know. And this is very, very common in most network environments. If someone's going to travel on a regular basis, you're going to go ahead and set them up with a smart card or a token. And then from there, they will have to physically have that item. And in the case of a smart card, they'd have to have a smart card reader as well. So the smart card would have a certificate on it, which would be read, and then they would have to enter their PIN or password along with it. Or there's also the token. And the neat things about the tokens is that they will generate a rotating set of credentials that are only usable once. And that's what it really ends up being the most secure form of remote access or VPN connectivity, because that way, if, let's say one of your users is in an airport, using some kind of public computer, and somebody else has inserted what's called a key logger onto that computer. Well, a key logger is just that. It logs all the different keystrokes. Well, this way, when the user enters the random ID that token generates, that's only usable once, well, they can log that all they want. So great. That's essentially like the username, but it's a username that can only be used once. So anyway, Windows Server 2008 VPN servers can support pretty much any authentication protocol, any common authentication protocol that we have out there, ranging all the way from we'll let anybody in to the absolute security with a token or a smart card. Now, the other thing I will tell you is that, and I'll show you this when we get to the interface, is these are checkboxes basically. Okay, so each one of these items is a checkbox, and if you have more than one checked, so let's say you had PAP, CHAP, and MS CHAP v2, all three of those checked, well, what is going to happen is it's going to attempt the most secure environment it can first, and then only if that fails, maybe a client can't support MS CHAP v2. It'll then go down to the next highest form of authentication, which would then be CHAP. So those are your authentication protocols. Now let's take a look at the VPN protocols. Now, for many years, we've had two VPN protocols to choose from. Whereas now with Windows Server 2008, we have a third. Now, before we even get to that third protocol, let's start at the top here. The first one is PPTP, the point-to-point tunneling protocol. This was the original VPN protocol. PPTP has been around pretty much as long as VPNs have been around. But I'll tell you what, even though PPTP has been around for a very long time, it is still considered to be a very usable, very secure protocol. Okay, now PPTP uses the MPPE, Microsoft point-to-point encryption. That's actually redundant. MPPE encryption would be Microsoft point-to-point encryption. So it uses MPPE. That is pretty much the original encryption technology, but still a good one even to this day. It would be primarily used with your pre-Windows 2000 clients. And that's because before Windows 2000, that's all we had. We only had PPTP. Now, as of Windows 2000 and everything newer, so for the last, well, however many years it's been since 2000, we have L2TP, which stands for Layer 2 Tunneling Protocol. The Layer 2 Tunneling Protocol uses IPsec encryption, which is considered to be more advanced and more secure than the old MPPE. And as I said before, it was first supported with Windows 2000. So for a good many years, we've had these two VPN protocols available to us. And I'll tell you what, to this day, L2TP is probably the #1 most widely used VPN protocol. But we do have a new one. With Windows Server 2008, we now have SSTP, which stands for the Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol. And I'll tell you what, this solves a major dilemma that administrators have been fighting for, well, I was going to say many years, but you know what? Pretty much since the beginning of VPNs. See, SSTP uses SSL, okay? It uses the same SSL that you see in HTTPS. Okay, so it uses the secure socket layer. As I said before, it's new to Windows Server 2008. And here's where it comes in real handy. It's used when PPTP and L2TP protocols are blocked on a firewall. See, this is the problem. We may allow PPTP and L2TP to be open on our firewall, but what happens when you have a remote user in someone else's network and they have PPTP and or L2TP blocked? That's been the dilemma that we faced for many, many years. Well, now, because it's using the SSL channel of HTTPS, all they have to have open is port 443, meaning they just have to have the HTTPS port open on the firewall. And I'll tell you what, almost anywhere you go, that port is going to be open. Why? Because pretty much any network you're on is going to have web access. And if it doesn't have web access, well, then you're probably not going to do a VPN anyway, because the whole idea of the VPN, the virtual private network, is to connect via the internet. So if you can't get to the internet, well, then you're not going to VPN anyway. Now, if you can get to the internet, well, odds are not only will the standard port 80 for HTTP be open, but port 443 for secure HTTP will also be open, because a lot of today's internet is done on secure websites. Now, the one thing that you need to know about SSTP is that clients must have at least Vista with Service Pack 1. So anything older than that, if you have Windows XP or Windows 2000, those clients don't support SSTP. Only Vista with Service Pack 1 is going to support the SSTP VPN protocol. And I will tell you that you're going to find that this is going to become more and more common. But because of that limitation, SSTP is not heavily used. It's only used in those isolated scenarios where you're required to because of the PPTP and L2TP limitations. Now, I will also tell you that another thing you need to keep in mind is that with SSTP, just like with anything else you're going to do with SSL, well, you're going to have a web server certificate assigned to your VPN server. Now we'll talk about certificates in a later video, but you're going to have one if you're going to use SSTP on your Windows Server 2008 VPN server. Okay, well, what's going on with Global Mantics these days? Well, this is going to be a pretty simple scenario, as you can see here. Global Mantics wants to allow their sales users to be able to connect to the New York office while they're away on business. Okay, plain and simple. You got sales users, they're out traveling all around the country, all around the world, and while they're out, they need to be able to connect into New York. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into Windows Server 2008. We're going to go onto one of the New York servers. We're going to install the remote access service, and you'll see that there's actually a bigger role that is used that includes the remote access service. So I'll show you that. We'll then configure the remote access service to support VPN connectivity, and then we will create a VPN connection from a client. We'll go out to one of our New York Vista clients and see how easy it is to create a VPN connection to the server. And we'll see that it's all working. So let's go take a look at one of those servers now. For this demonstration, we're going to go ahead and connect with New York Member 1. This is a Windows Server 2008 member server that we have set up and have used in a couple other videos, but we're going to go ahead and use it as our remote access / VPN server here. So let me go ahead and connect to that now. And I will tell you, while we're connecting, I have made a couple of quick changes to this server. So if you're following along, you're going to want to make these same changes. Let me show you what they are. I'm going to click on Start, and I'm going to right-click on Network and select Properties. And then in the Network and Sharing Center, I'm going to click on Manage Network Connections. Now you'll notice that I have 2 local area connections. What I've done is I have added a second network card to this computer. And the reason why is because in order to provide VPN access, it's not an absolute requirement that you have 2 cards. For all intents and purposes, it's a requirement. And the reason why is because from a logical point of view, you need to have one card that connects to the internet where the remote users are going to connect in, and then you have to have another card to connect to the internal network to allow the user to be connected to that internal network. So I've added a second card, and what I've also done is I have assigned them both static IP addresses, because quite honestly, to be a remote access server or a VPN server, you're going to be acting as almost like you're acting like a router. And if you're going to be providing services like this, you're going to want to have static IP addresses, so you're not a moving target. So just to show you, let me click on Start and go to my command prompt and type in ipconfig, and you will see here that one of the cards, local area connection 2, let me move this down, local area connection 2 has an IP address of 192.168.11.1, so it's on the 192.168.11 network. And then our original local area connection has 192.168.10.1. Okay, so that's on the 10 network, the 192.168.10 network. Now, I will say this. Let me close that. The terms local area connection and local area connection 2 aren't very revealing. So how about we rename this? I'm going to right-click and select Rename, and let's call this Internal. Okay, so that's for the internal network. And I'm going to right-click on local area connection 2 and rename it to External. Or I could have called it Internet Connection. Okay, but these are names that are a little bit easier to understand. We have our internal connection and our external connection. All right, so that's really all I've done to change this server from the way we had it before. Is I've added the card and I've given them static IP addresses. So if you need to do that, go ahead and pause the video, do it, and then resume, and we'll continue. So let's close our network connections window, close the network and sharing center, and now what we need to do is install the remote access service. We do this by adding a role. We add a role by clicking Start and selecting Server Manager. In the server manager, we want to go ahead and click on roles. And you'll see here it'll take just a moment while it collects all the data. You'll see here's our file and print services that we've previously added. But I'm going to click on Add Role. And the role we now want to add is the Network Policy and Access Services. So I'm going to check that box and click Next. Here's a quick introduction into what this role is. I will click Next again. And you will see here that I have a number of different role services to choose from. Now, in the next video, we're going to get into this Network Policy Server service. But for right now, we want the Routing and Remote Access Services, and more specifically, the Remote Access Service, because that is the service that will provide VPN connectivity. So I'm going to check this one box. You'll notice this box kind of became gray to say that we've got some of this service. We have a sub-service here. And that's all we want, just the one remote access service. And go ahead and click Next and install. Now, it'll take a few minutes for this to go ahead and install the role. So I'm going to pause the video and I'll come right back to it as soon as it's done installing. All right, the installation has succeeded, so let's go ahead and click on Close. And we can actually now close out of the server manager now that we see that the Network Policy and Access Services role has been installed. And where we want to go is click on Start, Administrative Tools, and go to the Routing and Remote Access utility, which has been added to the Administrative Tools menu with the installation of this role. Now, one of the interesting things about remote access and this service role is, unlike other roles where you install it and it's pretty much already kind of there and running, in this case the services are not running. Let me go ahead and expand this. You'll see here that we have the red down arrow, because what it's telling us is that New York Member 1, well, the role's there, and that's why we have the utility, but it's not been configured, and so therefore the services have not been started. So let's go ahead and take care of that now. What I'm going to do is right click and select Configure and Enable Routing and Remote Access. And I have to tell you, let me go ahead and click that. And while this is opening up, I want to tell you that remote access is something that many years ago was a real pain in the rear end to set up. Whereas now Microsoft has made it is a bunch of quick and simple wizards to get everything rolling. So pretty much everything we're going to do is going to be done through easy to follow wizards, and there's just a couple of small details that you need to be familiar with so you can make your selections. So let's go ahead and click on Next to our welcome screen. And now we get to pick what type of configuration we want. And you'll see here that we can do remote access, which would be either dial-up or VPN, which, by the way, if you were wondering why I keep talking about remote access and VPN like they're one and the same, see, years ago, remote access was known, the quote-unquote remote access was known as your dial-up remote access. And then VPN was something that was separate. Well, because dial-up is essentially, for all intents and purposes, a thing of the past. I mean, people don't use dial-up modems anymore. We just simply refer to VPN as remote access now. Now, we also have some other selections here, like network address translation, which is actually a form of security, really, to help with internet connectivity, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We can actually do a VPN with NAT. Again, we're not worrying about NAT right now. We could set up a secure connection between two private networks, and this is where we could pretty much go ahead and set up a direct VPN connection from one office to another. So if it's more than just a remote user trying to connect, but two offices trying to connect to each other, we could do that. And then, of course, there's other custom configurations that we can do. Well, in this case, we're just going to go ahead and do a simple remote access VPN connection. So I'm going to click Next. And now it's asking me, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to do dial-up or do you want to do VPN? I'll go ahead and choose VPN. Now, I will tell you, if I selected dial-up, believe it or not, you can still do VPN even if you set it up as a dial-up connection. You just are somewhat limited out the gates on your VPN abilities. You'd have to modify them by hand. So In this case, because we know we want to do VPN, I'm going to go ahead and check that box. I'm going to click Next. Now I need to select the network interface that is going to connect this server to the internet. In other words, which interface, which network card is the one that the external users, get the wording I've used there, external users want to connect to. And obviously it's the external card that we want to use. Now this checkbox is also new to Windows Server 2008. This is an added security feature to where I could now enable security to where I set up packet filters which are going to only allow VPN traffic to gain access on this particular card. So if this server was not being used for anything else, so if there was no internet connectivity that was going to be used via that card on this server other than for the VPN, then I can check the box, and then packet filters would be set up specifically to allow only VPN protocols to connect. So I am, for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to actually clear that checkbox because this server is used for other things and I don't want those things to be limited. I mean, for instance, one thing I have found is since I am connecting to this server via remote desktop, even though I am theoretically connecting the remote desktop connection to the internal card, I've seen where these packet filters can sometimes get in the way. So you're going to want to be careful with that when you use that in a production environment. So for right now, I'm going to clear that box because we're not really worried about the security in this demonstration. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And now we have to determine how IP addresses are going to be assigned to the clients when they connect in. See, the client will already have an IP address on whatever network it's on. In other words, if one of our users is at home, their home network, it's going to already give them an IP address. Or if they're out at a hotel, the hotel will give them an IP address. Or if they're visiting another company, that company's network will give them an IP address. But those IP addresses are used to have connectivity in those networks. The client computer needs to be given another IP address to be able to go ahead and work within our own local network. And our choices are we can either do it automatically. If we have a DHCP server available, then that DHCP server can assign that IP address to the remote clients. And if we don't, well, then we can set up a static range. Now, for the moment, I'm going to check this button, but we're going to come back because we're eventually going to do automatically because we do have DHCP. I just want you to see the screens that you'll encounter if you're not using DHCP. So I'm going to click this button and click Next. And here you'll see I get to assign an actual range. So I could click on New and then give it a physical range. And it has to be a range that is within our own internal network's range. It has to be a range that's not used by other computers on the internal network. Okay, and it has to be large enough to be able to support however many remote clients you have coming in. Okay, now again, we don't want to do that statically here. Let me go ahead and click back and go to automatically because we do have a DHCP server available to assign IP addresses to the clients. Now, speaking of the DHCP server, there's something I want to show you. So I'm going to leave this wizard right where it is, and I'm going to go away from New York Member 1 for just a moment, and let's go ahead and connect to New York DC 1. And the reason why is because this is the DHCP server for our network. So I'm going to click on Start, Administrative Tools, DHCP. And I want to show you, let me go ahead and maximize this, that we do have a range on our 10 network. Okay, you'll see here we have 101 to 120, so we have 20 addresses. We probably would need more if we, to support all the different clients, but in this instance, it will be enough. And if you look at the leases here, you'll see there's a few of them that have been given out for a few miscellaneous machines that we have around here right now. And I'm going to leave this right here because I'm going to show you what happens to this screen when the remote access server is done being configured. Because you're going to see that you don't even have to have clients connecting for the remote access server to go ahead and take IP addresses. So let's leave it on this screen for just a moment. Minimize this and go back to our New York Member 1 server. And let's finish configuring this server. And we'll click Next. Now, as far as managing multiple remote access servers, this would be done through the use of something called Radius. And a Radius server in Microsoft World is called a Network Policy Server, or NPS server. Now, the Network Policy Services server is something that we're going to get into in the next video. So for right now, I'm going to say no, we're not going to use Radius. We're just going to go ahead and use a single remote access server. Click Next and Finish. And you'll see here that we get a message that says to support the relaying of DHCP messages, we need to configure the DHCP relay agent. Now what this means is, let me go ahead and click OK. And it's going to go ahead and start the routing remote access services. And while this starts, let me explain. When a client connects to the remote access server, any of the additional DHCP options like default gateway, DNS servers, Win servers, things like that, well, it won't get that information from the DHCP server. What it does is it takes the same default gateway, DNS server, or Win server that the remote access server has been assigned. Okay, so if you want to have custom DHCP options for your remote access clients, then you're going to have to go ahead and install the DHCP relay agent on this remote access server. And I will tell you what, let me go ahead and expand IP version 4. This is where you would do it. You would right click on General and you would select New Routing Protocol. And you'll notice it says there's no additional protocols available, and guess what? I wasn't paying attention. The DHCP relay agent had already been installed. So that's where you would do it. So as for instance, if I go ahead and delete the relay agent, now I could right click on General, New Routing Protocol. Here's DHCP relay agent. Click OK. And there it is. And then I would have to go in and configure it. The reason it was there is because this server has been used for other things in which we had already set up that relay agent in the past. And even though the routing and remote access services were not installed when we first came to this machine, well, because they had been previously installed for other videos and other services, it remembered that we had that there. Now, in order to configure the relay agent, I would have to right click and add an interface. And I would go ahead and select the internal. Notice, by the way, internal is a default name as well. So internal might not have been the best name for us to use. I might have wanted to put local network or something like that on the name. Click OK. And now I've enabled the DHCP relay agent on that internal network so that the clients can go ahead and get the additional DHCP options from the DHCP server. But speaking of DHCP options, let's go back to that DHCP server now. On New York DC1, here we have our address leases. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and refresh the screen. And a couple things I want to point out to you. One, notice that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 IP addresses have been given out that weren't there before. And the reason why is because the clients don't actually directly interact with the DHCP server. This is exactly why we needed to do the DHCP relay agent. See, the remote access clients only communicate with the remote access server. So what the remote access server does, and as you can see indicated by RAS, see RAS on these 10, and then also New York Member 1 is the one who's been given that IP address. The remote access server goes to the DHCP server and says, hey, I'm a remote access server and I need 10 IP addresses. And then it will hand those out to the clients as they connect. Once those 10 have been used, the remote access server comes back to the DHCP server and says, I need 10 more. So one thing to definitely keep in mind is you're going to want to have a large enough pool on your DHCP server to be handing out blocks of 10 at a time to your remote access server. So that's one thing that I wanted to show you that happens on the DHCP server. But the other thing I wanted to show you is within the scope options. If you want to have custom scope options for your remote access clients, you can now do this in Windows Server 2008. I'm going to right click and go to Configure Options, and you will see here, if I go to the Advanced tab, that we now have a user class called the Default Routing and Remote Access class. If you set that specific class and then give options to that class, these options will only be given out to the remote access clients. So this is something that's kind of cool, is we now have a specific class that we can put our remote access clients into to give them unique DHCP options. Now we're not going to worry about doing that here because I don't have a sophisticated enough network set up. I mean, the reality is well, these options are the correct options to set up for our remote access clients connecting into the New York office. So I don't have a need to do it right now, but that's how you would do it. All right, so that's all we need to look at with New York DC1. So we'll put that away, come back here to New York Member 1, and what I want to show you is right up here, if I click on ports, you will see that a lot of ports, I'm going to scroll down here, a lot of ports have been configured for VPN connectivity. And to be specific, you'll notice that if I scroll down here, notice they all say SSTP. I'm going to scroll down, and when I get to, I got to go a little further. And I got to go up a little bit. You'll notice that there's a total of 128. This says 127, but that's because we started at 0. There's a total of 128 VPN ports that have been created for SSTP. And if I scroll down a little further, you'll notice the same holds true for PPTP. There's 128 of those that have been set up. And if I go down just a little bit further, you'll see here that L2TP has the same setup. So right now we can support 128 simultaneous SSTP, L2TP, and PPTP VPN connections. That's a lot of connections. Matter of fact, that may be more connections than our bandwidth can handle. And that's really what it comes down to, is you need to set it up for however many ports, or however many connections, I should say, you think that your internet bandwidth can handle. Now the way you set this up is by right-clicking on ports and going to Properties. And this is where you'll see that we have our PPTP, L2TP, and SSTP all set up at 128 ports. Now even though SSTP has been set up to support 128 ports, right now this server cannot support SSTP connections. And the reason why is because, as I said a little while ago, we would have to have a web server certificate established and assigned to this server. And like I said, certificates is something we'll get into in a later video. So we're not going to set that up right now. But both L2TP and PPTP would be supported at this point. Now, if I want to change the quantity of connections that I want to allow, all I have to do is highlight the specific protocol and select Configure. And then it's right here that I put in the maximum ports that I want to allow. So if I want to reduce the amount, I could put it down, let's say maybe to only 50 ports, or maybe I want to increase the amount. Maybe I want to say I want 256 ports to be allowed on this particular connection. Again, what it really comes down to is bandwidth. And these days, bandwidth has gotten to be so inexpensive that usually you have more than enough to go around for all your users. And quite honestly, you don't really have to do anything. Once we finish the wizard, we're kind of done. We support 128 connections, and unless you have more than 128 users who are going to simultaneously connect into a VPN server, you're done. Now, one other thing I do want to show you is the authentication protocols. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the server itself and go to Properties. And then on the Security tab, here you'll see that we're using Windows Authentication. There's a drop down. We could use Radius, but again, that's something I said we'll get into in the next video. But under Windows Authentication, I'm going to click Authentication Methods. And you'll see here that we have a screen where we can choose the Extensible Authentication Protocol, MS-CHAP v2. We could select CHAP, we could select PAP, and we could even allow unauthenticated access. Now, if I have all 5 of these boxes checked, this one right here would definitely be a scary situation. But even though all 5 are checked, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to go ahead and connect in an unauthenticated manner. As a matter of fact, what the system will do is it will start off by attempting to use an extensible authentication protocol. If it realizes that the user who's trying to connect, if the client is not using any form of smart card or token or anything that would support EAP, well, then it reverts down to the next most secure authentication protocol, and it's going to go to MS-CHAP v2. If it comes to realize that this is not a Microsoft client, well, then it's going to go down and attempt to use CHAP. If, for some reason, and I cannot for the life of me think of what reason it would be, there was some client connecting that didn't even support CHAP, well, then at that point it would go down to PAP, and everybody supports PAP. So, quite frankly, this unauthenticated access would never happen. Okay, so the default is that we use either EAP or MS-CHAP v2, okay, because we want to have a high level security with our remote access clients. So my recommendation, once again, is there's really nothing you have to do. You go through the wizard to set up routing remote access, and you, in many cases, can be done. Unless you have an isolated set of circumstances that are going to call for either the requirement for SSTP, at which point you need to go ahead and get a certificate and set that up, or maybe you have to, for whatever reason, limit the number of ports or expand the number of ports, or if you know for a fact that you're going to have non-Microsoft clients, then you go ahead and update the authentication protocols to include CHAP. But otherwise, we're pretty much done. There's not much else to do. Now, there is one other thing that we do need to do, and that is we need to go set up a client connection to this VPN server and test to see if this connectivity actually works. So let's go take a look at a Vista client now. Okay, here I am now on New York Vista 1. Now, the reason that I had to switch over to this computer instead of connecting via remote desktop is because I've had to take this client off of the Global Mantics network. Okay, I had to take it off the 192.168.10 network. And as a matter of fact, let me go ahead and log on here. You'll notice that I'm logging on as the local administrator, not the Global Mantics administrator, because I'm not presently connected to the Global Mantics network. What I've done is I've changed this IP address to the 11 network. Let me show you this by going to a command prompt and typing ipconfig. And you'll see here that I'm now on, I've given it a static IP actually of 192.168.11.101. Okay, this puts it on that external network that New York Member 1 is connected to. The equivalent of it being out on the internet. Okay, and then connecting in. So that is a change that I've made to this client, and you need to make the same change if you want to try to follow along. Now let me go ahead and close the command prompt window, and what I'm going to do is click on Start, and I'm going to right click on Network and go to Properties, which will take us into our Network and Sharing Center. In the Network and Sharing Center, there is an option here to set up a connection or a network, and that's what we want to do. We want to set up a VPN connection. Again, Microsoft has taken us so far from the way it used to be to how we used to have to set this up. Now, this is an amazingly simple wizard, and it's pretty much written in layman's English. I mean, what do we want to do? We want to connect to a workplace, right? We want to connect to our our work's local network. And it says here, set up dial-up or VPN connection. So I'm going to click connect to a workplace and select next. And it says, how do you want to connect? Use my internet connection doing a VPN or dial directly? Well, I want to use the internet connection. We're going to set up a VPN. Do you want to set up an internet connection before continuing? See, if you need a specific connection to get to the internet in the first place, well, you can set that up now. But because I already have a connection to the internet, I'm just going to go ahead and say I'll set this up later. Now I need to give it an IP address of the actual VPN server that I'm going to connect to. So I'm going to type in 192. Oh, didn't have my numlock on. 192.168.11.1. That is the IP address of New York Member 1's external IP address. And then we give it a name. Now, the default is VPN connection, and that's fine. Or if you wanted to get more descriptive, we might say, let's see here, I'll do Global Mantics. Okay, so now we're saying VPN to Global Mantics. If we were using multi-factor authentication, we could say that we're using a smart card. But in this case, we're not, so I don't need to worry about that. If we're going to allow other people to use this connection, well, then we could check that box. And what all that really means is, are other people who are on this computer going to also need to set up this VPN connection, or just me? And, typically that box does not get checked, because typically you'll end up having a laptop and there's just the one user who's using the laptop. But if you are the administrator and you're logged in as administrator, then you would check that box to go ahead and allow the regular user to also have this connection. And then go ahead and you'll notice that this is grayed out, but it says don't connect now, just set it up so I can connect later. Yeah, that's fine. We don't actually want to make a connection now, we're just setting it up. So I'll click next. And then here's where you could go ahead and enter in a username and password. Now, I'm not going to put this information in. The main reason for entering this would be if you were going to check the box saying remember this password. Okay, and again, if you were setting this up for some other user, well, then you would go ahead and do this. But I'm going to leave it blank because I'm going to show you how you can enter this in later. I'm just going to click create. And it says you need to set up an internet connection before you can connect. I'll click close because I have an internet connection already. And now what I want to do is manage network connections. And you'll see here that here's our VPN Global Mantics connection. You'll notice it's defaulting to PPTP. I'll show you how to change that in just a moment. But the first thing I want to do is go ahead and I'm just going to double click on it. And it brings up a window asking me for my credentials. Okay, so this would be an example of where you were setting it up for multiple users, not one specific user. You would leave this blank. So now you can go ahead and put in a username. So we'll just go ahead and say administrator. And we'll put in the administrator's password. And we're going to say for the Global Mantics domain. And again, we could choose to save this username and password for me or for anyone. Now I'm going to say for me only. I don't want other users logging in and using these credentials. But I am going to go ahead and save this information so I don't have to type it as I continue to demonstrate these connections. Now I'm going to go ahead and click connect. Now here you'll notice that we ended up having an error. It did not connect. And the reason why is because by default nobody is allowed to connect to a VPN server. Okay, now this is something that can be managed on an individual user by user basis within Active Directory, or can be managed on a, well, there's many different criteria that can be used on a network policy services server. And again, that's something that we'll get into in more detail in the next video, but for right now we're going to manage it via Active Directory. So let me go ahead and close this because we're not going to be able to connect. And what I need to do now is I need to go over to New York DC1. So let me go over there now. Okay, here we are back on New York DC1, and let me go ahead and close DHCP. We don't need to look at that anymore. What I am going to do is click on Start, Administrative Tools, and go to Active Directory, Users and Computers. In Active Directory, I can go to a specific user, and in this case I want to go down to this user's container, and here's the administrator account. And I'm going to go into the properties of the administrator account, and you'll find that there's a dial-in tab. On the dial-in tab, you'll see that by default it says control access through the NPS network policy. These policies we'll get into in the next video, so for right now I want to give manual access by simply clicking a button that says allow access. See, by default there is an NPS policy that's always there by default, and that default policy says don't let anybody in unless they've been granted explicit access here in Active Directory. So this is kind of the old way of doing things, the old manual way of doing things, and I don't recommend that you do this on a regular basis. This would be something you would do only if you knew that you were going to have an isolated couple of users. Because if you're going to have a large quantity of users, and those users may change over time, that you need to have connecting remotely, well, then you're going to want to do it through a policy, not on an individual user by user basis. But anyway, I clicked allow, and I will click OK, and close out of here. And now let's go back to the Vista client and see if it worked. Okay, back here on the Vista client, I'm going to once again double click, and you'll notice it remembered administrator. The password is already saved, Global Mantic, so I'm just going to click connect. And now it went through, and although there wasn't much to see, it kind of went through really quickly. I'm connected. And you can verify that. Well, one, right here it says connected, but you know, kind of yip-de-doo. How do I prove that I'm connected? Well, another way that I can kind of see this connection is by going back to a command prompt and typing ipconfig, because check this out. Not only do I have my actual local area connection, which had 192.168.11.101, but I have a VPN connection, which has been given 192.168.10.112. How about that? Okay, so I have an IP address on the .10 network to connect into the Global Mantics, or more specifically, I could say the New York network. Now, speaking of the Global Mantics or New York network, let's head on back over to New York Member 1 and see what has happened on that end. Okay, back here on New York Member 1, I'm going to also go to a command prompt because I want to show you something. If I do an ipconfig, what do I have here? Well, I have the external connection of 11.1. I have the internal connection of 10.1. Those were already there, right? But then I also have a dial-in connection, and this is the IP address that connectivity is truly taking place through with any of our VPN clients. We've added that third IP address, which is acting as the dial-in interface. So this is something that you will see on all VPN clients and all VPN servers when connections have been made. All right, let's go back over to Vista 1. All right, back here on Vista 1, there's just one more thing really I want to show you, and that is if I go into the properties of our VPN connection, right-click, Properties, you will see here on the Security tab, under the Advanced Custom Settings, and I'll click on the Settings button, I can go ahead and establish what authentication protocol we're going to use, just as we did on the server side. Okay, so in this case, you'll notice that we are using MSChap v2. If we knew that we were going to use EAP, we could select that. Or if we knew that we, for whatever reason, we're going to go back down to CHAP or PAP, we could go ahead and select those. Not necessarily as typical on a Vista client that you would go down to these, because it's not as likely that you're going to be connecting to something that requires CHAP or PAP on the server side, but it is available to you. Now if I back out of here and go to the networking tab, you will see that this is where we can select the type of VPN. It defaults to automatic, and you'll notice that the automatic then defaults to PPTP. But if we wanted to go ahead and select a specific VPN protocol, we just pull this down and say, specifically, I want to connect via PPTP, L2TP, or SSTP. Okay, so that's how we can go ahead and select on the client which VPN protocol we want to use. And I'll tell you what, just like I mentioned on the server side, pretty much everything is done through these simple wizards. It's all set up properly for you, and there's very little in the way of alternative configuration you need to establish unless you have a specific set of circumstances that calls for those changes. Otherwise, these defaults pretty much work. Alright, well, that's how you set up a VPN server. At this point, you should know how to follow some really simple wizards. Now, you should know how to install the remote access service, which is really a role service included within the network policy and access services role. You should know how to configure the remote access service to support VPN connections. And this is really where the wizard kind of does everything for you, but you also should know how to manually go in and alter the number of ports, alter the authentication that we're going to support, know how to set up DHCP options and set up the relay agent. And you should also now know how to set up a VPN connection on the Vista client to be able to connect into the remote access server that has been set up for VPN support.